Xabi Alonso will be appointed as Chelsea's new manager on a 4-year deal this summer, towards the end of the season, the start of next season. Whatever way this summer he's taken over at Stamford Bridge. And as such, we had to get Joe Krishnan back on the show. Joe's obviously a part of our English team. He watches Chelsea religiously, more than anyone else at Transfermarkt for sure. Joe, obviously need to ask you about your instant reaction to the Xabi Alonso story, but I feel like we have to give ourselves a pat in the back here, because last time we had you on the show, you and I had a pretty detailed discussion about how Chelsea maybe have to take a different approach to things after a disastrous season. And I think we can safely say the bigwigs at Stamford Bridge were clearly listening to that show, because Xabi Alonso feels like a slightly different tactic or approach to how the current owners and people that run the club have been doing things, since they came in, I suppose.
Yeah. This is definitely a shift in the strategy at Chelsea. And I think, the owners have had that period of reflection where they realise that things have gone wrong. This season particularly, but obviously in the past as well. And a lot of it's come down to the manager appointments, but obviously the recruitment is a big part of that. And I think it's a really exciting appointment for Chelsea, first of all. And I think actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually the best they could have done right now in terms of the available candidates. We know, obviously, they interviewed Andoni Iraola, spoke to Oliver Glasner as well. But I think Alonso brings that respect and pedigree from his playing career, which other players will resonate with in terms of picking Chelsea as their next club. As you say, there's been a shift in perhaps the role that Alonso is going to have as a manager rather than a head coach. So he's going to be more involved in the transfers and recruitment. And I think that can only be a good thing for Chelsea, because, the young player targeting hasn't quite worked out. I wouldn't say it's been a complete failure. You look at Cole Palmer and Esteval, for example, but there's a definite need to get more experience and also players at the highest level in a Chelsea to truly contend at the top, with Arsenal, Manchester City, Liverpool, and even Manchester United now. So,
yeah, it's a really, really interesting one, and almost a degree of kind of managerial kind of merry-go-round, because you've got Alonso going to Chelsea, Maresca potentially then going to Manchester City, the former Chelsea head coach. Areola apparently going off to Bayer Leverkusen, I've heard. It's nothing confirmed there by any means, but that's the news today. So yeah, lots of moving parts there. But as you said, I think fair to say quite a few people surprised. I mean, I think a lot of people maybe thought Alonso was biding his time to see what happened at Anfield with Arne Slot, and perhaps even what was happening to Pep Guardiola at Manchester City. But he's decided to move on to Chelsea. And as you point out, really importantly, if you read between the lines, or read the lines themselves, I suppose, in the press release, he has been appointed as the manager, not the head coach. And we have to maybe point out, for people whose English isn't their first language, perhaps, or people who aren't, as well versed in the inside baseball, football that we are, but that typically means he plays a role in transfer policy, as opposed to a head coach who just picks a squad that he's given from the recruitment team. And that is kind of the crux of what we want to talk about here, isn't it? Because you obviously watched a lot of Alonso at Real Madrid. You covered a lot of Spanish football as well. I dealt with a lot of him at Bayer Leverkusen. I actually interviewed him for Transfermarkt when he was at Leverkusen. And I think, interestingly, when you look at Leverkusen's strategy when Alonso came in, they were a club who were very famous for developing young players and selling them on. Heung-min Son, Havertz, countless others. Obviously, Florian Wirtz is a good example as well. And then you look at the players that they signed when Alonso first comes in. They obviously still have younger players. You have Nathan Tella, Victor Boniface, Granit Xhaka, Jonas Hoffman, Alejandro Grimaldo. These are all older senior players who are there to win things. The second season as well, Alex Garcia, Martin Terrier, Buendia to an extent as well. Now, some of those players didn't work out, and some of them worked out really, really well, but it was a very different shift in Leverkusen's transfer strategy when Alonso came in. It was very much a case of saying, I'm not here to stay for 5 or 6 years. I'm here to win something, prove that I'm a good head coach, and I'm going to do that with ready-made players. And I think that, Joe, is what's so interesting about him showing up at Chelsea now, because, well, Chelsea, I don't think we could say Chelsea are the Bayer Leverkusen of the Premier League by any means, but they have followed a similar strategy under the current owners of hoovering up young players, developing them. Okay, keeping the good ones, as you say, with Palmer, Esteval, but then looking to kind of farm, if you will, the younger ones off, or the lesser ones off to either their sister clubs or to other clubs to sell for profit. Do you think Alonso coming in is maybe a sign that that might change?
It's difficult to say at this point, but I would say that the fact that Alonso has made it almost like a requirement to have that input on transfers and not just let the sporting directors run roughshod in the transfer market is quite important, because already he has more influence than Graham Potter, Mauricio Pochettino, Maresca, and also Liam Rosenior. I mean, he did have that brief January window, but he basically had to work with the squad he had. But we're hearing that Alonso wants mentality monsters from some reports, and I think that's kind of similar to what Mikel Arteta has done at Arsenal. It's not. I don't think Arteta, for example, has recruited young players, but they're sort of 23, 24, already established, already very experienced, with room to grow. And I think that's what Alonso will be looking for in terms of, he's not going to be signing 34-year-olds for Chelsea, or if he does, it would be maybe one player who's of that kind of 30 age to provide a bit of experience and leadership at the back. But you look at Leverkusen when he had the captain was the goalkeeper, Patrick, if I'm
Yeah,
pronouncing it wrong.
Herdecki, yeah.
Yeah, so he obviously sees that role as a goalkeeper is very important, also involved in possession as well. But having someone at the back providing leadership is incredibly important. That's why I think Chelsea could go for maybe an older goalkeeper to provide some know-how for the younger ones. I mean, we've got Nick Plender's coming back from Strasbourg next season, and there's high hopes to him. But throwing him in at the deep end would be quite too fast. He's only 20 years old. And then you look at the defenders, the recruitment then. Chelsea have signed Yoel Parto, Benoit Badiashile, so Disassi. They're all quite young. I think that the next signing they're going to make is not necessarily an old player, but someone that's got Premier League know-how. So maybe someone like Marcos Senesi, Murillo, Lacroix from Crystal Palace, that will not only bolster the Chelsea back line, but also provide that leadership and help them form a bit more of a solid base. And yeah, obviously we know about Alonso, his favourite setup with the back three. I think it's like 4 behind the striker, is that right? Like 2 centre midfielders, a couple of number 10s behind the striker. I think that's really going to benefit this Chelsea team, allow them to express themselves a bit more freely. Especially you look at Palmer. When you give him the ball and he's confident, there's not many better players in that position. And I think you mentioned about the experience of some players that he brought in, Xhaka, Grimaldo. It's more important than ever that Chelsea hang on to those players that they've had for 3 or 4 years and help Alonso build that squad. And I think one of those players could be like Marc Cucurella. He's been there for Chelsea for 4 years now, 28 years old, I think, on his next birthday. He could easily fill in that role that Grimaldo had, as an attacking wing back. We saw it in the FA Cup match in the semi-final, but also the final. There's a lot of things that I like that Alonso has done at Leverkusen, and I think it has been the blend of youth and experience. You had Florian Wirtz, who really, really shone under him, and Victor Boniface. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how he uses this first summer to build his Chelsea team. I think the important thing is you don't just bring in 9 or 10 signings, but maybe 3 or 4 that the team really need.
I was just thinking, as you mentioned there, they should be signing any 34-year-olds, but I was kind of daydreaming about the idea of maybe Grimaldo on one wing, Carvajal on the other. He's obviously leaving Real Madrid, former Alonso teammate, I'm almost certain, or former Leverkusen player as well. That would be quite the audacious move. But I think it's really interesting. I think when you look at the Chelsea players and you look at how their market value has changed since they joined Chelsea, I think there's an interesting kind of contrast between the two. If you look at the bottom, the players who lost the most market value, obviously Mudrik's at the bottom because of his off-field stuff, but then it's Romeo Lavia, it's Benoit Badiashile, Jamie Gittins, Wesley Fofana, Liam Delap, Garnacho, Jorgensen, Sugio, the defence midfielder. They're all players who have lost market value since joining Chelsea, and I know for a fact, and you know for a fact, that some of those players are going to lose more in this market value update. All very young players, untested, maybe thrown in the deep end if you want to be polite, but undoubtedly kind of transfer projects that haven't worked out. Then you look at the players who've gained the most market value during their time at Chelsea, and it's Cole Palmer, it's Reece James, it's Chalobah, Enzo Fernández, Moisés Caicedo. It's those kind of senior big players that you mentioned that the club really have to hold on to. So do you think with bringing in Alonso and maybe this push to more of a short-term approach to squad building, it's not really just about signing older players, but perhaps it's also about convincing those players we just mentioned there, those key players, to stay? Because last time we had you on the show, we were talking about the likes of Fernandes, Caicedo, and even Cole Palmer potentially leaving this summer, and Cucurella as well, of course.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Obviously you have to kind of prove to the likes of Enzo Fernández, who want to see some ambition shown by the club, in order for them to stay. Moisés Caicedo, that they want to play with the best players. And okay, Barcelona, Real Madrid, PSG, they have stars in their squad. And you can see the appeal of wanting to play there, but they bought into the Chelsea project. They want to see progress. And I think the best way to do that is to convince a few players. I'm not going to suggest that Chelsea will go and sign Kvaratskhelia, for example, because why would he go from PSG to Chelsea at this point, and when Chelsea have been in disarray? But if you can use Alonso and his pedigree to kind of attract those names, it will definitely have an effect on the rest of the squad, in terms of the competitiveness amongst them as well. So you mentioned obviously Gittins and Garnacho. These are two players that were signed by the sporting directors knowing that they weren't going to be starters, but they could fight for their place in the team. They just haven't shown enough to earn that place in the team. So if you were to sign, let's say, Kenan Yildiz, who has been linked with Chelsea, Arsenal and whatnot, that's an immediate, how should I say, call for them to improve. And it's an example for them to try and aspire to. And they haven't really reached those levels at Chelsea yet. I think it's too early maybe to call time on their careers as such at the club. They will be itching to prove that they got what it takes to play in an Alonso team. So that kind of appointment, perhaps you could say the players weren't motivated by Liam Rosenior's arrival as such. But Alonso, every player wants to play for that guy. Everyone wants to be part of that exciting project. And I think that you were mentioning obviously the squad values. Obviously with players like Lavia, it's to do with injuries, but there's definitely been a number of Chelsea players who have not performed on the pitch, and that's why their value's gone down. But then you look at João Pedro, just comes straight in from Brighton, got his head down, worked very hard. I mean, the fans really appreciate that. He's been named player of the season today. So that's an example of what can happen when the club are in disarray. What about when things are going right on the pitch? We could have a team that could be ready to dominate for 2 or 3 years with just a few signings. If things go right, of course. I'm not going to get ahead of myself there, but I do genuinely believe that this is a step in the right direction, not just for project and developing those players, but also attracting better players to Chelsea to improve the squad as a whole.